The proposal by the Department of Labour's National Minimum Wage Commission could hike the minimum wage by more than 8%. The proposed increase will be calculated at 0.5 to 1% above the Consumer Price Index. The current minimum wage of 23 Rand 19 cent per hour has been in effect since the 1st of March 2022. It is also the first time that domestic workers were officially entitled to the full minimum wage. Commission Chair Professor Adrian van der Walt says the Commission's aim is to ensure the value of the national minimum wage does not decline relative to the median wage. Millions of households have grappled with rising food and transportation costs as a result of surges in food and fuel prices following supply chain disruptions after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Stats SA says the prices of bread and cereals were 20% higher in November as compared to the previous year. The price of laundry soap went up by 38%, sunflower oil by 32%, and coffee saw a 25% increase.
Well, for a little bit more on this, we're now joined by COSATU's Parliamentary Liaison Officer, Matthew Parks. Matthew, Happy New Year. Is this a good New Year's present for you? What are your thoughts?
Yes, Happy New Year's to listeners as well, and to you, Peter. So I think for us, this is quite positive news. We had proposed as COSATU to the Minimum Wage Commission last year when they asked for the first round of public comments that we should look at CPI, which is about 7.4, 7.6%, depending which month you take, plus about 3%. The Commission has actually come with a recommendation of CPI plus 2%, so not just CPI plus 0.5% or plus 1%. We think that's quite critical because workers are really suffering because of inflation. Inflation is at an all-time high of about 7.4%. But if you look at the inflation for petrol, for electricity, for transport, for food, which hits workers, it hits the unemployed much more significantly than it hits the middle class or the wealthy, it's actually higher than that. So I think for us, this is positive news. What needs to happen now is that the Commission has made requests for public comments until the 13th of January. We'll be doing our comments as COSATU as well to say we support the recommendation of CPI plus 2%. That's going to help a lot of workers who are really struggling. We're seeing the value of the salaries being eroded. We also think it's positive to the economy because there's not too much that companies cannot afford it, and it will help to inject a bit of additional stimulus to the economy because when workers have extra money, they will spend it on food, on transport, on electricity, on clothes for their children, etc. What's critical then after that is that for the Commission to move with speed to make its final recommendations to the Minister of Employment and Labour, who must then make the final decision and to promulgate it. We want them to move with speed because normally this increase to the minimum wage happens on the 1st of March. So we don't have too much time because government also needs to go through certain processes too, including publishing it in the Government Gazette. So employers should know by at least by the beginning of February what is the final recommendation. So I think for us this is positive news. It also builds, Peter, upon several years worth of increase we've had in minimum wage since it came into effect in 2019. When it first came into effect, it was 20 Rand an hour. We're now looking at 25 Rand, 26 Rand an hour plus. So that's a significant increase over the past 4 years. We've also seen a positive increase for domestic workers who were originally at 15 Rand an hour in 2019 and have now equalized it. And equally for farm workers who had 18 Rand an hour when it first started in 2019. So those are quite positive things. It's not enough. We must still deal with the cause of inflation, like the fuel price, electricity prices, and so forth. But I think that is critical to protect workers from seeing their wages being eroded by inflation.
All right, we'll talk about the influence of wages on inflation just now, but help us understand who's this minimum wage for? Because we know in various sectors this just won't wash.
Sure. Well, look, I mean, so it covers about 6 million workers, farm workers, domestic workers, workers in the construction industry, at petrol stations, security guards, cleaners, workers at restaurants, at hotels. So quite a significant chunk of the private sector. If we didn't have it, then we'll see there'll be no bottom level upon which workers will be paid. You might recall that about a decade ago, farm workers are getting paid as little as 6 Rand, 8 Rand an hour. So this is critical to make sure we don't pay workers below which it's physically not possible to survive. It's not a living wage, but it's meant to be a minimum wage below which you shouldn't be paid less. It does help to push wages up to provide a bit of competition amongst employees to pay better wages to the workers. We should also bear in mind that if we say we cannot afford it, well, can we afford to pay workers peanuts?
Yeah.
If we pay workers peanuts so they can't even provide transport to get to work, can't even provide food for their children, how are they going to be productive workers? Who's going to buy the goods that we produce in our factories, in our restaurants, in our cinemas, in our shops, etc.? So you need to get the right balance. We think the minimum wage does provide a minimum entry level. And if you look at countries like in Europe, in the US, Japan, China, other parts of Africa, etc., Latin America, when the minimum wage has been introduced, it's helped to make sure workers' wages are pushed up. It's helped to reduce inequality in society. It's helped to stimulate the economy. And we've seen those kind of effects as well since it was introduced in 2019.
I remember the last time the minimum wage was raised, there was a whole debate about domestic workers in particular, where there was a fear that employers, they themselves struggling, will actually end up either reducing the working hours of their helpers or not having them at all. Is there a danger this could happen this time around as well?
Yeah. So look, so when the minimum wage was introduced in 2019, domestic workers and farm workers were deliberately pegged at a lower rate. Domestic workers were at 75% at 15 Rand. Farm workers were at 90% at 18 Rand. And that was to give time for those sectors to adjust, for those employees to have sufficient time to prepare and so forth. It was out of fear to avoid possible job losses, because those are quite large sectors of the employment force, about 900,000 each roughly, and also kind of vulnerable to retrenchment, to automation, etc. So when you look at the reports from Stats SA over the past 4 years since it came into effect, and even with COVID-19, we haven't seen significant job losses in those sectors. It's been largely stable, or in fact, in some areas it's increased. When we did see some job losses for domestic workers, it was because of COVID-19 in 2020, when we shut down the economy, and many people were just simply sent home without getting paid. Since that time, out of those 2.5 million jobs that were lost in 2020 across the economy, most of those jobs have been recovered, and we've seen over this past year, 2022, the last 3 quarters, unemployment fell by 1% each quarter. So we're confident it won't happen. But having said, if there's an employee who generally can't afford it, they are entitled under the Minimum Wage Act to apply to the minimum wage to the Department for Exemption. They must provide some financial proof of their hardship, but they can get it. But it's to avoid just simply saying, well, everybody's struggling, so therefore we can exempt everybody.
Yeah.
And if you don't, at times, they change, society won't evolve for the better.
So does this amount then include payments for transport, any food that the workers might be provided with? Might the employer say, well, you want 4,750 Rand, then buy your own food and get to work on your own money?
No, sure. There is that space as well. So this is basically just the bottom level below which you cannot be paid. It does allow for some deductions for it, because in some instances, farm workers stay at a farm. They might have a tab at the farm shop, or they might have electricity or water cost and so forth. Yes, those can be deducted, but there must be an agreement between the worker and the employer. But no one can be paid below the minimum wage as it is. Of course, there are times we need to also prevent possible abuses, like you're mentioning, where someone's entire wage could end up being deducted. That's why you do need to have workers joining trade unions, so they're able to negotiate for them. They're able to negotiate in collective agreements, having the unity of numbers and strength, etc. Because if you don't have that kind of situation, if you have workers negotiating individually, they will often be exposed to abuses, to exploitation, and to real hardships, and even violation of their legally entitled labor rights.
All right. How far are we away from moving from a minimum wage to a living wage, do you think?
So that's a good question. So look, in law, in South Africa and across the world, there is no legally prescribed living wage. It's more of an aspirational objective. Part of the Minimum Wage Commission, which I've begun to look at last year, is to try to identify what is the medium-term target, what is that they should next be moving towards from the original 20 Rand now approaching 25 Rand an hour. We think we should be looking at moving towards the roughly estimated target of a living wage, which in South African circumstances is about 6,500 Rand an hour, about 7,000 Rand an hour if you take into account inflation and so on. So we should be looking at that. It's not going to happen overnight. If we look at the state of the economy, where we have an unemployment rate of 40%, 3%, that we're still emerging from a recession. But it is critical that we do set targets, because if we don't do so, then we'll continue just to plod along and not to make progress as a society. We need to have what is a realistic roadmap to achieve it? Is it over 2 years, 3 years, 4 years? What makes sense? But I also need to say, what are the economic interventions that we need to put in place as a state, whether it's around ensuring reliable and affordable electricity, or fixing the railway network for passengers, for goods. What is it the private sector needs to put on the table as well in terms of stimulating the economy, etc., or creating jobs? Because if you put in place those factors, then it's much easier to achieve the living wage. Or if you simply hope that the economy improves on its own good luck, then it makes it much more difficult and will take much longer. So we need to be much smarter, more strategic about how we work towards achieving it.
Matthew, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much indeed. Always good to talk to you. And let's hope we march forward and continue to make progress. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that's Matthew Parks, who's COSATU Parliamentary Liaison Officer, speaking to us about the National Minimum Wage Commission putting on the table 8% increase on the current minimum wage, which at current inflation rates would put it up to 25 Rand 13 cents. And that would mean, if you're working 9 hours a day, 4,750 Rand a month.